When the sea parted, Moses' impossible escape. A people ready to die, or witness a miracle. What would you do if you were trapped between death and the impossible? Run. Scream. Give up? The people of Israel were right at that point. And what happened next changed the course of human history forever. Pharaoh had finally given in. After 10 devastating plagues that shattered Egypt's pride, Moses, directly guided by the voice of God, led the people out of slavery. Men, women, children, the elderly, babies in arms, carrying on their backs the crumbs of what was left of their belongings. They marched. In haste. In fear. In hope. But freedom, my friends, would not come easy. When the Israelites reached the shores of the Red Sea, despair hit them hard. In front of them, deep and violent waters. Behind them, the thunderous sound of Egyptian chariots closing in. Dust rose on the horizon. The thunder of horses sounded like the sky tearing open. The hearts of the Israelites, once filled with hope, now beat in panic. Some began to shout, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die here in the desert?" Others murmured, "It would have been better to remain slaves than to die in the middle of nowhere." Revolt started to spread among the crowd. But Moses stood firm, eyes fixed on the heavens, heart anchored in the God who had made a promise. He knew the story wouldn't end there. And in the midst of desperate cries, Moses declared to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." While the people looked at him, Moses looked to God. What would happen now? What was the next move? The sea was immense. The Egyptian army was relentless. The people were vulnerable. And God was silent. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The rumble of chariots mixed with the roar of the waves. Doubt mingled with faith. And then, God spoke. "Why are you crying out to me, Moses? Tell the people to move forward." Move forward? To where? Into the sea? It was insane. Illogical. Suicide, by human standards. But Moses knew. When God commands, the impossible becomes the path. Raising his staff as God had instructed, with eyes full of faith and trembling hands, Moses stretched out his arm over the waters. And there began the greatest spectacle heaven had ever revealed to earth. The wind blew. The waters stirred. And slowly, as if obeying an invisible order, the sea began to part. Towering walls of water rose on both sides, forming a dry corridor in the middle of the ocean. The impossible opened right before the eyes of a once enslaved people. Cries of terror turned into stunned silence. Weeping turned to reverence. God was making a way. The crossing of the impossible. The ground, once covered by deep waters, was now dry under the feet of the Israelites. It was like walking inside a miracle. Their first steps were hesitant. Wide eyes stared at the towering walls of water rising on the left and right, liquid walls sustained by an invisible and uncontrollable power. The smell of salt, the sharp breeze on their faces, the sound of the wind blowing fiercely, keeping the path open. It was all surreal, divine, otherworldly. Each step was a mix of faith and fear. With every meter moved forward, the people looked back, expecting the sea to collapse at any moment. But it stood firm, because the hand of God was holding the impossible open. Children were rushed on their parents' shoulders. Mothers clutched their little ones tightly. The elderly leaned on makeshift staffs. And yet, they marched. They marched between walls of water that seemed to whisper, as if they held the very secrets of God. They marched because turning back meant death. They marched because the only option was to believe that the God who opened the way would lead them to the other side. Meanwhile, Egypt was not giving up. Pharaoh himself, hardened by pride and blinded by rage, commanded, "Follow them. Let none escape." Royal chariots, gleaming with gold and terror, tore through the sand with fury. Horses neighed. Soldiers raised spears. The smell of iron and death filled the air. The Egyptian army entered the path opened through the sea. They saw the same walls of water. They stepped on the same dry ground. But they didn't understand. That path wasn't for them. It was a corridor of salvation for God's people. And it would be a corridor of judgment for the enemies of God. But driven by madness, by their thirst for power, they pressed forward. Ahead of them, Moses marched on, eyes fixed on the horizon, leading a people who, despite their fear, chose to move forward. Each step felt like a miracle. Every heartbeat was a hymn of faith. The wind kept blowing, strong, constant, sustaining those liquid columns that defied every human law. And in that supernatural scene, a people enslaved for centuries walked into freedom, not by weapons, not by might, but by the power of the God who writes stories through the improbable. When the last Israelites stepped out of the sea's path, a wave of relief swept over them. Up ahead, the promised land was still a distant dream. But in that moment, they were alive, and for the first time, free. But the story wasn't over. Because while the Israelites reached the far shore, the Egyptians were still in the middle of the path. Then God spoke to Moses again. "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians, their chariots, and their horsemen." Obedient, Moses raised his hand once more. The wind stopped. A heavy silence fell. And suddenly, the walls of water came crashing down. The roar of the waves sounded like thunder exploding over the Egyptian army. Chariots were swept away. Horses drowned. Soldiers screamed, but their cries were swallowed by the furious sea. And in an instant, the greatest army on earth was crushed by the breath of heaven. From the other shore, the people of Israel watched in silence. It was unbelievable. It was majestic. It was living testimony that the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14 verse 14. There on that day they saw, the God who opens a way is also the one who closes it to your enemies. And in the sands of the desert, they began to understand. They weren't just fleeing Egypt. They were walking toward a destiny crafted by the hands of the Most High.
The Song of Victory and the Journey Through the Desert. When the Israelites saw the last Egyptian horse swallowed by the sea, when the dust of the chase faded into the silence of a completed miracle, a new feeling flooded their hearts. Victory. After generations knowing nothing but chains, brutal orders, and the sting of whips, they finally breathed in freedom. And there, on the shores of the Red Sea, under a sky as vast as the promises of God, they sang. Moses, the unlikely leader, once a baby placed in the Nile, later a fugitive in the desert, now raised his voice with power. "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and rider he has hurled into the sea." The words echoed through the desert. They bounced off the dunes and returned as praises. Men and women, young and old, joined in the song. And there, beneath the scorching sun, was born the first free choir of Israel. But there was more. Miriam, sister of Moses, a prophetess full of courage and faith, picked up a tambourine. She called the women, and she began to dance. Their garments flowed in the wind. Their sandals kicked up dust. Their eyes sparkled like those who had seen the impossible come true. With tambourines in their hands and praises on their lips, they celebrated the God who not only heard their prayers, but acted with indescribable power. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously." They sang in unison. It was more than a celebration, more than gratitude. It was freedom made into music. But little did they know, the parted sea was only the beginning. The journey would still be long. The desert, relentless, and the faith that had opened the sea would need to be renewed every day. The promised land would not be handed over easily. Trials would come. There would be thirst, hunger, and internal battles. There would be days when faith would be the only available water. And God knew that. So, while the people celebrated on the shores of the Red Sea, heaven was already preparing the next lesson. Right after the song, the march resumed. 3 days through the desert of Shur. 3 days without finding water. The heat crushed them. The wind carried sand that scorched the skin. Children cried from thirst. The elderly stumbled from exhaustion. The praise that had filled the desert now gave way to murmuring. That's how humans are. They quickly forget the sea that opened. When the desert dries up their hope. Then they arrived at Marah. Finally, water. But when they tasted it, it was bitter, unfit to drink. The people, on the brink of collapse, began to complain. "Moses, what are we going to drink? Moses did what he always did. He ran to God. With a broken heart, he prayed for help. And once again, God responded. He showed Moses a piece of wood. Moses threw the wood into the waters of Marah. And before the tired and unbelieving eyes of the people, the bitter waters turned sweet. They drank. They were satisfied. And there, God made a covenant with them. If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, none of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians will I bring on you. For I am the Lord who heals you. Exodus 15 verse 26. There at Marah, Israel learned that God not only opens the sea, he also turns life's bitter waters into springs of renewal. Because God doesn't just want to free us from slavery. He wants to teach us to depend on him at every step of the journey. The Red Sea was the deliverance. The desert would be the school of faith. The desert teaches trust. After the sweet victory at Marah, the Israelites continued their journey through the vast desert. The bitter waters had been transformed. Once again, God had proven his care. But the desert is relentless. And soon, thirst gave way to a new, even more urgent need. Hunger. Days passed. The provisions hastily brought from Egypt ran out. Empty stomachs began to ache. The hope that once shined bright now flickered like a weak flame in the wind of despair. The people began murmuring again. Oh, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But you've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly. Harsh words. So quick to forget the sea that had opened. So quick to doubt the God who sustains the universe. Once more, Moses cried out to God. And God, in his infinite patience, responded with something never seen before. Manna. I will rain down bread from heaven for you. Exodus 16 verse 4. And so, the next morning, a miracle took place. All around the camp, resting on the evaporated dew, were small white flakes, fine like frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they asked each other, Man who? What is it? And Moses answered, This is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. The people bent down, gathered that mysterious substance, and ate. It tasted like wafers made with honey, nutritious, gentle. It was bread from heaven. But the miracle came with rules. Each person was to gather only enough for the day. They were not to store it for the next, except on the day before the Sabbath, when they were to collect double. But disobedience soon appeared. Some tried to save it for the next day, and what had been a blessing rotted. It bred worms and smelled foul. God wasn't just feeding bodies. He was training hearts to trust. There, in the middle of nowhere, with the sun blazing and the desert stretching endlessly, God was teaching daily dependence. Yesterday's miracle wasn't enough. Faith had to be lived today. And tomorrow, trusted again. Faith is not a stockpile. Faith is daily dependence. But man doesn't live on bread alone. Soon, thirst returned. At Rephidim, another trial. There was no water. Again, the people erupted in complaints against Moses. Give us water to drink. And again, Moses cried out, What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. God responded with a new miracle. He commanded Moses to strike the rock at Horeb with his staff. Moses obeyed. And from the depths of that dry rock, living water burst forth. The people ran, drank, and were satisfied. The God who parts seas also makes springs flow from stones. In that desert journey, Israel was learning something many still don't grasp. God is not just the God of great, spectacular miracles. He is also the God of small daily wonders. The morning bread, the water from a rock, the unexpected relief. Every provision was a reminder. You depend on me, day after day, step by step. The same God who opened the sea was now feeding them in the middle of the sand.
The first battle, when raised hands brought victory. The people of Israel were learning to depend on God in the desert, learning to trust the manna that fell from the sky, the water that flowed from the rock. But now, a new kind of threat would appear, a human attack. While they camped at Rephidim, a cruel and ruthless enemy approached. The Amalekites, a people trained for war, violent, merciless. They saw the Israelites, tired, vulnerable, with no combat experience, as easy prey. Without warning, they attacked. The desert, once a place of trials of hunger and thirst, now became a battlefield. So Moses called upon Joshua, young, courageous, but inexperienced, to lead the defense. Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." Moses would not fight with a sword. He would battle in a different way, with his arms raised to the heavens. The next day, while Joshua and his men fought the Amalekites with all their strength, Moses climbed the hill, accompanied by Aaron and Hur. There, under the blazing desert sun, with burning rocks under his feet, Moses raised his hands to the sky, and something supernatural began to happen. As long as Moses' hands were raised, Israel was winning. But whenever he lowered his arms, Amalek would begin to overpower them. It was as if the victory wasn't just tied to the sword, but to intercession. The problem is, human arms have limits. And Moses, already an old man, couldn't keep them raised for long. His muscles trembled. Sweat dripped down his face. Pain gripped his shoulders. But giving up was not an option. So Aaron and Hur, seeing his struggle, did something brilliant. They brought a stone for Moses to sit on, and each of them took one of his arms, one on each side, holding, lifting, and together they won. Not by the strength of warriors, not by the sharpness of weapons, but by unity, by faith, by a prayer that never dropped. Until sunset, with Moses' arms held firmly upward, Israel prevailed. Joshua defeated Amalek and his people by the edge of the sword. And there, God commanded Moses to record that moment. Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it. I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. To mark that miraculous victory, Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." Exodus 17 verse 15. There, the people learned a powerful truth about spiritual warfare. There are battles we don't win just by fighting with our hands. We win on our knees. We win when we don't stop raising the arms of faith, even when they get heavy. Sometimes, the victory depends on those willing to hold up the arms of someone who can't lift them anymore. The people who once doubted, now experienced firsthand what it meant to be sustained. Not just by bread, not just by water, but by the very hand of the living God. And the desert journey continued. It wouldn't be easy, but now they knew. God was in the battle. God was the invisible general. And with him leading, every impossibility would become a victory. The mountain that trembled, the encounter with God. After the victory over the Amalekites, Israel continued through the desert toward an encounter that would change their destiny forever. God, who until then had revealed himself through signs, miracles, and deliverance, was now about to do something even more extraordinary. He would speak directly to his people. Moses led the multitude to the base of Mount Sinai, a dry, towering, majestic mountain that rose on the horizon like heaven's forgotten throne. There, God called Moses, "Go up the mountain and tell the people, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all nations." It was an invitation, but also a challenge. Being chosen by God would require holiness, separation, obedience. And the people, still moved by all they had witnessed, responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said." They had no idea how serious that commitment would be. Then the heavens prepared for a spectacle few human eyes had ever seen. God would descend upon the mountain. But first, he ordered the people to sanctify themselves. For 3 days, they camped around Mount Sinai. They washed their clothes, abstained from their usual routines, guarded their bodies and spirits, prepared their hearts. The atmosphere was tense, full of expectation, full of reverence. Something monumental was about to happen. And then, on the 3rd day, the heavens exploded. Lightning tore through the black clouds that had gathered over Sinai. Thunder boomed so loud that the ground shook. The mountain was covered with smoke, like a massive furnace. And in the middle of that fiery storm and thunder, God's trumpet sounded. A sound like nothing they had ever heard. Deep, vibrating, piercing. The people, even from a distance, trembled. Strong men, warriors who had fought Amalek, now staggered like frightened children. They knew God was present. Not a symbol, not a story, but the living God himself. Moses, summoned by the divine voice, ascended the mountain. Every step was cloaked in thick smoke and heat. The ground burned beneath him. The air pulsed around him. Climbing wasn't just physical. It was stepping into the territory of holiness. When Moses reached the top, God spoke, "Go down and warn the people not to break through to see the Lord, or many of them will perish." The holiness of God was so intense, so pure, no one could touch it and live. Moses descended, gave the warning, then climbed again. And then, God revealed his will. No longer just through wonders and signs. Now, through words etched by his own hand. It was on that burning mountaintop that God gave Moses the principles that would guide humanity forever. Sparkles the 10 Commandments. Each commandment, an expression of God's heart. Each word, a line tracing the path of life. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make idols. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. While Moses received those eternal words, the people camped below watched the smoke, heard the thunder, and felt the mountain tremble. Their hearts wavered between awe and fear. God was not a myth, not an idea. He was real. He was fire. He was a voice that echoed through the valleys. And now, he was the supreme lawgiver, the invisible king who would guide Israel, not just through miracles, but through principles. That day, heaven touched earth, and nothing would ever be the same again. The God who parted the sea was now opening a new path, the path of obedience and covenant. The golden calf, a fall in the midst of a miracle. While Moses remained at the top of Mount Sinai, receiving divine instructions and laws that would shape generations, the people at the camp began to corrupt themselves. The days dragged on. The sound of thunder and the trumpet of God grew quieter. The smoke at the summit of the mountain was still visible, but time weakened their faith. Anxiety turned into fear, fear into doubt, and doubt into rebellion. They began to murmur, "This Moses, the man who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. We need a God to go before us." And then, spiritual tragedy struck. Aaron, Moses' brother and right-hand man, gave in to the pressure. He told everyone to bring their gold earrings, their jewelry, the spoils they had brought from Egypt. With that gold, they molded a statue of a calf, a golden calf, gleaming, imposing, a perversion of the true glory they had once witnessed. And before this newly crafted idol, they proclaimed, "Here is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." They danced around the image, offered sacrifices, gave themselves to spiritual and moral debauchery. The people who had seen the sea part now bowed before an image they had made with their own hands. At the top of the mountain, God saw it all, and his voice, that had just delivered commandments with love, now echoed in righteous fury, "Go down, Moses. Your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." God's anger burned. He told Moses he would destroy the rebellious people and raise a new great nation through Moses alone. But Moses, interceding like never before, pleaded, "Lord, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self." Moses appealed to God's faithfulness. And incredibly, Scripture says, "Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened." Exodus 32 verse 14. But God's mercy wouldn't erase the consequences. Moses descended from the mountain, carrying the 2 stone tablets, written by the very finger of God. As he neared the camp, he saw the calf, saw the dancing, heard the songs of idolatry. Fury took hold of him. Moses smashed the tablets. He threw them at the foot of the mountain. a violent protest against the people's betrayal. He took the golden calf, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, mixed it with water, and made the people drink it. A bitter lesson. A physical reminder of the bitterness of infidelity. Then Moses turned to Aaron. "What did these people do to you, that you led them into such a great sin?" Aaron tried to justify himself, blaming the people and downplaying his part. But God had seen everything. Divine judgment followed. Punishment came. That day many died, and sorrow hung heavy over the camp. The same people who had sung on the shores of the Red Sea, who had celebrated the manna, who had marched victoriously after Rephidim, now stood broken, ashamed, because witnessing miracles is not enough. You must guard your heart. Yet God did not abandon his promise. Even in his disappointment, he reaffirmed his word. "My angel will go ahead of you." But he warned, it would no longer be the same. The relationship had changed. Trust would need to be rebuilt. In that painful episode of the golden calf, Israel learned the hard way. Miracles do not replace faithfulness. Emotion does not replace holiness. Religion without obedience is nothing more than disguised idolatry. The path to the promised land would continue, but now with scars, reminders of the cost of rebellion. Moses' cry, "Show me your glory." The camp was silent. The people, broken and ashamed, gathered the ashes of their own rebellion. The music had ceased. The profane dances were replaced by lowered gazes and heavy hearts. Israel knew they had broken something precious. And the most painful part was not only the punishment received. It was the possibility of losing God's presence. God spoke to Moses, "Go, ascend to the land which I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will send an angel before you, but I will not go up in the midst of you, for you are a stiff-necked people, lest I consume you on the way." Exodus 33 verses 1-3. The people, upon hearing these words, wept bitterly. What good would it be to reach the promised land if God himself was no longer among them? It wasn't about reaching Canaan. It was about not losing what really mattered, his presence. Moses, feeling the weight of this separation, took action. He pitched a tent outside the camp, the tent of meeting. There, he sought God face to face. There, he poured himself out in intercession. There, God's glory descended as a cloud, visible to all. When the cloud descended upon the tent, the people would rise respectfully at the entrance of their own tents, and worship in silence. It was as if every breath in the desert paused, when God came to speak with Moses. And it was in this atmosphere of deep reverence that one of the most powerful prayers in the Bible was born. Moses dared to make a request. "If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here. For how will it be known that we are your people, unless you go with us?" Exodus 33 verses 15-16. Moses knew. Without God's presence, Israel would just be another people in the crowd. Without God's presence, the journey would just be suffering without purpose. He didn't just want the destination. He wanted the companionship. And then, at the height of his spiritual hunger, Moses went further. He made a request that few would dare to make. "I pray you, show me your glory." What a prayer! It wasn't a request for victories, riches, or fame. It was a pure, desperate request, filled with thirst. "I want to see your glory, Lord, the God who created the universe, the God who challenged Egypt, the God who opened the Red Sea." Moses wanted to see him up close. No veils, no intermediaries. And God answered. But out of love, he limited what Moses could see. "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. But you cannot see my face, for no man shall see my face and live." Exodus 33 verses 19-20. The Lord then placed him in the cleft of the rock, covered him with his hand as he passed by, and allowed Moses to see only the back of his glory. Even so, it was such a powerful revelation that Moses' face shone like the sun. When he came down from the mountain, the people could not even look directly at him. It was as if heaven itself had marked Moses with its light. This experience taught Israel, and us, one of the deepest lessons of faith. It's not enough to want blessings. It's not enough to seek deliverance. It's not enough to conquer territories. What makes the difference, what sanctifies, what transforms, is God's presence in the journey. The glory of God is more precious than any promised land. And there, in that cry in the sands of the desert, Israel understood that their true identity would not be defined by military victories, nor by riches, nor by conquests, but by the presence of the living God walking among them. The restoration of the covenant. God decides to walk with his people. After Moses' intercession and the boldest request of the entire journey, "Show me your glory," the atmosphere in the camp changed. God had answered. He would not abandon his people. But there was something important to be done. The covenant needed to be restored. The tablets of the law had been broken, a physical symbol of Israel's betrayal of the covenant. And now, God commanded Moses to ascend Mount Sinai again, this time with 2 new stone tablets in his hands. At dawn, Moses rose, cut the 2 tablets as the Lord had commanded, and ascended the mountain again, alone. There, the same God who had written the first law with his finger would now manifest with even more power. The Lord descended in the cloud, stood with Moses there, and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and merciful, slow to anger, and great in goodness and faithfulness." Exodus 34 verse 6. God did not just rewrite the words. He revealed his character. A God who forgives, but who is also just. A God who punishes sin, but who never abandons those who repent. A God who does not change, but who loves to renew. Moses, prostrate with his face to the ground, worshipped, and then, once again, he interceded. "Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, go with us, even though this people is stiff-necked. Forgive our iniquity and sin, and take us as your inheritance." And God responded with something glorious. "I make a covenant. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in all the earth, nor among the nations." There, in the reverent silence of the mountain, God rewrote the tablets of the law with his own hands. The covenant was standing once again. Israel had failed, but God remained faithful. When Moses descended from the mountain, something extraordinary happened. His face shone, literally, so much so that the people could not even look at him directly. It was as if the glory of God, which had touched Moses on high, was now reflected on his skin. Moses began to wear a veil over his face whenever he spoke to the people. He would only remove it when entering the presence of God. It was a living reminder. Those who walk with God bear visible marks of heaven. From that point on, the people resumed the construction of the tabernacle, the movable house of God in the desert. Men and women brought voluntary offerings. Fine fabrics, gold, silver, acacia wood, oil, precious stones. Every detail had a precise measure. Every curtain, every ring, every piece of furniture followed a divine instruction. God was not only dwelling among the people. He was teaching them how to be worshipped with reverence, order, and holiness. The tabernacle would be the center of Israel's spiritual life, the place where God's glory would manifest, the place where the people would seek direction, forgiveness, and his presence. And when everything was ready, when each curtain was hung, every utensil in place, the altar raised, the lamps lit, the glory of God filled the tabernacle. A cloud descended, and fire was kindled. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Exodus 40 verse 34. Moses could not even enter. The presence was so dense, so alive, so powerful, that the place was filled with holiness. Now, when the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, Israel knew it was time to depart. If the cloud stayed, they camped. It was God who guided them. Day by day, step by step, the covenant had been restored. The people were forgiven. The presence was back. And the God who makes a way is still at work. Dwelt in a journey that began with a crowd fleeing Egypt, crossing the Red Sea with bare feet and eyes full of wonder. now ended with a truth engraved in Israel's heart. God was not just leading the people. He was shaping a relationship. It was not just a deliverance. It was a process of transformation. Between Egypt and the Promised Land lay the desert. And in the desert, God taught that faith is worth more than bread, that obedience is worth more than sacrifice, that His presence is worth more than any blessing. The sea opened. Yes, it was a miracle, but it wasn't the greatest. The greatest miracle was God staying by a people who failed so many times. God didn't give up on them when they grumbled. He didn't abandon them when they made the golden calf. He didn't destroy them when they were unfaithful. On the contrary, God started over, rewrote the covenant, and promised to walk with them to the end. And today, you who are hearing this story need to know. Backhand index pointing right, the God who opened the Red Sea is still making impossible ways. Maybe you're facing deep waters, a problem that drowns you, a debt that seems to paralyze you, a pain that seems immeasurable, a past that screams louder than the present. But listen carefully. If you are surrounded by pain behind and the impossible ahead, you are in the perfect place to see a miracle. Because God hasn't changed. He still sends the manna. He still makes water flow from the rock. He still forgives the repentant hearts. He still restores covenants. He still answers prayers that say, "Show me your glory." The sea you face today may seem vast, but the God you serve is bigger. And if He made a way where there was no road, He can make a way where you only see darkness. The Exodus story is not just about a people. It's about us. About everyone who has ever felt enslaved, cornered, afraid. About everyone who has ever thought about giving up. About everyone who needed a new beginning. And about a God who, even though He is a consuming fire, is also a Father who walks in the middle of the desert. Sparkles, so lift your head. The sea may seem closed, but the sky is still blowing. And when God blows, the impossible obeys. Megaphone closing and call to action. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a like, because it helps this message reach even more lives. Subscribe to the channel to receive content like this, full of faith, depth, and truth. And comment below. God still makes impossible ways. I want to pray for you. May the same God who opened the Red Sea open a new season over your life now.